Alright, thank you everybody. I want to welcome you to tonight's event, McLuhan in New York. My name is Jacqueline Reich, or Jackie. I am the chair of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham. And to some people I've been teasing Paul's boss. But not really. He was really, if you know Paul, he's kind of the boss. So there you go. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This is a really exciting event. There's a couple of people that I want to thank who are here and who are not here for helping us get this event together. I want to thank my great colleague Paul Levinson for organizing this event. It's so exciting, and he wrote me over the summer and said, "Can we do this?" And I said, "Yes." And so we've been working on this. I also want to thank my assistant Claudia Rivera and our educational technologist Chris Vicari, who really got everything set up today. And we're so great. They came over, they sent pictures to us. Here's the setup, here's how it looks. I want to introduce and thank Hopton Campbell, who is the director of the Walsh Multimedia Center at Fordham College Rose Hill, who is filming us tonight. And so who else? We have Garrett Broad, also a member of my department. Am I singing for the department? I don't think so. Nobody. So I'm not a media ecologist. I'm a film historian, and I'm proud to say, though, that one of my favorite moments of all time in film is the scene with Marshall McLuhan and it is the reason why, in fact, I only choose to write about dead people. Which is true. And I'm actually an area of specialization is Italian cinema, I was just telling Pablo, and stardom, but I only write about dead stars. So, without further ado, again, welcome for this really great event. Some people have traveled far distances and bore lots of traffic and suffering and pain and suffering to get here. And I welcome you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Paolo Granata, who is the academic coordinator at of the Book and Media Studies program at the University of Toronto, St. Michael's College.
Thank you, Paul's boss. Thank you for this introduction. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. On behalf of St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto, I want to welcome all of you. I know there are some St. Mike's alumni in the audience, so thank you all for coming. Well, let me point out that St. Michael's College is the McLuhan's intellectual home in the University of Toronto. So McLuhan came to teach to Toronto at St. Michael's College. And so we at St. Michael's College are very, very proud to be the McLuhan's intellectual home. Also the president of St. Michael's College, David Moroni, I'm bringing some greetings even in his behalf. And so we are very pleased to promote this event with Fordham University. And I was just thinking that in Toronto, McLuhan found the right kind of subsoil to establish a tradition, an intellectual tradition, to establish a school of thoughts. He played a fundamental role in establishing the so-called Toronto School of Communication and Media Ecology. So Toronto and St. Michael's College played a special role in the legacy of Marshall McLuhan. And then in 1967, as you know, Marshall McLuhan, along with his son Eric, came to Toronto. So came to New York. And McLuhan's father, McLuhan's son came to New York, and at Fordham they found the Holy Spirit. So I believe that Fordham provided a very stimulating environment for McLuhan in establishing relationship with the city and artist environment with scholars. It was a very, very special moment for McLuhan and for New York at all. And so here we are to celebrate this joint venture between St. Michael's College and the University of Toronto and Fordham University. Well, my teammate in this endeavor is Paul Levinson, and I'm very pleased to introduce Paul. Paul is a professor of communication here in media studies, communication and media studies at Fordham University. His non-fiction books have been translated in 12 languages. Non-fiction books include The Soft Age, Digital McLuhan, New Media. His recent short monographs include McLuhan in an Age of Social Media and Fake News in a Real Context. Are there some fake news? His science fiction novels include the so-called The Plot to Save Socrates. Even his stories and novels have been nominated for Hugo, Nebula, Sturgeon, Edgar, and many other awards. He appears on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, Fake News, Discovery Channel, National Geographic, and numerous TV and radio programs. So, in 1962, he published even an LP. He's a player, a guitar player, a singer, Twice Upon a Rhyme. So a very polymath and an artist, an integral artist, as McLuhan used to say. And just a final note, 1977, I was 1 year old, and
I was just 4 years.
And the journal, etc., the journal Review on General Semantics, published for the first time ever McLuhan's article on the laws of media. Guess who introduced Marshall McLuhan and laws of media in general semantics? Paul Levinson. Thank you.
Well, thanks. It's an incredible honor being introduced by the best dressed man in this room. First, let me tell you how we're going to work this. I'm going to introduce Eric, and Eric's going to talk. Then I'm going to come back here and have Paolo come up and say the same nice things about me again. But we'll come back up here and talk. And then I'm going to introduce John Carey. And at that point, when all three of us have talked for about 15, 20 minutes each, we're going to open the floor for questions. So I know you're going to have a lot of, urgent questions, but wait until all three of us have finished speaking, because we'll be able to use you even more, so you'll have more questions with anyone. I first met Eric about a year after I wrote that preface to the laws of the media. I thought that was such an important concept. This was back in 1977. And I said, we should have a conference about this, a Tetrad conference. And so about a year later, we organized a conference at Fairleigh Dickinson University, where I was then a professor. And that's the first time I met Eric. And that was a very interesting conference. Bob Bleckman is here in the front row. He delivered a paper at the conference. A couple of people who disappeared into the void delivered some very interesting papers. Marshall McLuhan, of course, made a major presentation. And so did Eric. And I already knew at that point that Eric McLuhan was far more than just Marshall McLuhan's son. I knew that Eric was an active collaborator in everything that his father was then doing in the 1970s. So Eric was not only here in that 1967-68 year at Fordham with his father, but he continued working with his father. And in particular, he did important work, Eric did, of his own, and in collaboration with his father on the Tetrads. So I was not at all surprised when in 1985, a few years after Marshall had passed on, Eric came out with a book called The Laws of Media. And that, to this day, is the preeminent, basically the only book totally devoted to Tetrads. Or it actually was the only book until just about a week or two ago. And we've tried to be very current here in Fordham. When another book was published, and that book, as a matter of fact, is back there on the book table if anybody wants to buy a copy after the talk. That book is called The Lost Tetrads, and as the title suggests, this book consists of tetrads that were not part of the 1985 publication. God knows where Eric scrounged around to find them, but he did. And by the way, in between those two books, Eric also wrote and co-wrote posthumously with his father a whole bunch of books. So Eric presumably is now going to talk to us about the Lost Tetrads. And I say the word presumably because I learned a long time ago with Marshall that when a McLuhan is up here talking, you never know what they're going to tell you. Eric?
My father always liked to lead off the talk with a joke. And it broke the ice a little, not that there's any ice in the room at the moment. So, metaphor. But here's one that he told on occasion back in 1967. I've got a collection of them. A chap at the embassy downtown was told to go out to Kennedy and pick up a Russian diplomat who's coming in on a flight. So he went out there in a cab, got there just in time. Traffic was getting pretty bad. It was about rush hour, and you know what that's like. And the diplomat got in the car, and they struck up a conversation. And the diplomat, of course, his first visit to New York or to anywhere in the States, he was rubbernecking at everything that was going on. He noticed the billboards, and they didn't have it back home in Mother Russia. And one in particular struck his attention because they were parked beside it in traffic. And it had the sign, "Take X-Lax and feel younger fast." Well, he was puzzled to know, and he asked the American rep, what does that mean? And the American was a little flustered. He wasn't quite sure how to explain this. But about then, the car picked up speed, and they were traveling through Harlem, I guess, on their way downtown. And they passed a pharmacy, and the American told the driver, "Stop here for a moment." He raced inside and got a package of X-Lax. You see this coming, don't you?
Boy.
So he got back in the vehicle, handed it over to the Russian, who promptly opened it and gobbled down 6 or 8. About 20 minutes later, they were about 3/4 of the way down to their destination at the embassy. And the American turned to him and said, "Well, are you feeling any younger?"
Yeah.
And the Russian said, "I don't know really, but I've just done something rather childish."
Yeah.
See, it breaks the ice fair. Back in those days, oftentimes jokes had a story attached to them. There's one I recall. This will be the last, but without a storyline, it's very simple. Who was Alexander Graham Kowalski? The first telephone pole. Whoops. Well, I got a better reception for the first one. Let's move on a bit. I'd like to to speak a little bit about that magical year that we had here at Fordham, the Schweitzer year. In fact, I gathered that a couple of students in that year are planning to be here. Is anyone here from them? Jackie? Jackie, let's see, Egan. No. Back then, she was Jackie.
Yeah, back here too.
Oh, yeah.
There's another one. And another where?
John Carey.
Oh, John.
Oh, yeah.
Were you a student?
He's a very unassuming student.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought, given your eminence, you were more a member of the faculty or something. Oh, well, I better watch what I say. We have a tape, audio tape with some pictures thrown in of that opening lecture. And we had it running just before proceedings start going. And I think the idea, Paul, is to run it again as soon as we're done.
Well, we're completely finished with that.
When we're completely.
Unless you'd like it run and just totally preempt your talk. No,
No, let's not get the vote there. I listened to it a few days ago and then wrote Paul excitedly. It's a magical lecture. It's the very first time that my father and the team of Harley Parker, Ted Carpenter, and John Culkin had met the group of students. It's the opener, the door opener. So John Culkin, Father Culkin, opens with a few remarks, and then he introduces my father, who speaks for about 10 minutes. And my father is followed by Harley Parker, who is a painter, and used to work at the Royal Ontario Museum as an exhibit designer. And he and my father wound up writing a book called Space in Poetry and Painting. So it's a counter juxtaposition of two arts, side by side, on facing pages. And throughout the book, there are 100 or so exhibits, 100 poems, 100 paintings, and in between each of them were some comments, the famous prose. That had never been done before, and that came out, I think, that year, 68, wasn't it? When Space and Poetry and Painting came out. It was a magical year, an exciting year. All kinds of things were happening. Let me put it in a bit of context for the older ones in the crowd. You'll be nodding at this, or I'll have words with you later. 1967 was the year in which the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came out. 67 was the year it started. 68 was the other half of the year. And that year, Magical Mystery Tour came out. Back to that. And of course, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of the Invention had something to say about Sgt. Pepper. And that's another talk, another time. That year, Harley, Ted, my father, I sort of bouncing around as a TA. Each of us gave separate sort of groups, classes, but we all got together at least once a week in a plenary session. At that year, I can speak mostly about what I did because I wasn't attending too many of the other sessions. I was sort of busy behind the stage, but I had, let me see, with Harley he and I started a course on the effects of television with the full group. And we discovered after a week or so, 2 weeks, that we were not talking to the choir. The students had, for the most part, they were fairly advanced in their studies, they were third or fourth year students. And they had already taken a lot of conventional courses in media, communications. There was no such thing as media studies, it was communications. But communications courses in film, history, film technique, and so on. Film as an art form, television, the same, radio, the same. They had quite a lot of preparation. So they were ready for this off-the-wall lunch. And Harley and I found that we were hitting the wall. We didn't know how to get through them, but they sure weren't buying what we were selling. Don't be shy, come on. Good to see you.
You can tell me that.
He's over.
There's nothing that makes you more popular than an SRO crowd. So it's much better than having it happen to empty. Anyway, we got together that evening after the second lecture. We dumped out, what are we going to do? How do we get through to this thing? And we came up with the idea of doing an experiment on the students, using them as subjects, not just as observers. And we wanted to start with some way of demonstrating the difference between film and TV. This is a big piece of the discussion. They're both moving image media. They seem to have a lot in common. They have soundtracks, but they don't have the same effect. How do you demonstrate it? Especially in TV, and by the way, color TV was just hitting the street in 1967. There were not very many color sets around, and they were great, big, enormous, clunky things. So TV was brand new, and people were very interested in the programs, and that's where their attention was focused. So we came up with the idea of a one difference test of the difference between film and television. What we did was this: we nipped around the corner to the AV room and got out the standard classroom movie projector, 16mm projector all over the wall. I'm sure you all know what I mean. There were a few of them around that took us recently, and then everything went digital. We got that out, and we searched around in the library of films they had. They had a lot of little short films. We had a 1-hour class. We wanted to show 3 movies. Each one had to be about 8 or 10 minutes long. That was the deal. And we'd show a movie and then ask the students for an essay and then show the next one and so on. And the room was organized something like this. It was a theater room. So at the front was a stage about this high off the ground. There was a center aisle, just like here. This wall had on the other side of it a corridor. Inside the building, 2 doors. This wall had big tall windows and curtains. That was the outside of the building. Just to give you a sense of where we were. We set up a projector right there where Francis is, where Francis, the guy who played church with me all the time. And the crazy Dick. Right there, we had a projector shining on a screen in the middle aisle, which was this way, not facing us, but this way. Half the audience on this side would look at the screen, right, turning to their left. The other half on this side would look at the screen by turning to their right. Okay. Get this in your mind. The speaker was underneath the screen, so the sound source was the same for everybody. It came from right here, under the screen. The screen itself was very high-tech. It was a bed sheet. Nice, clean, white bed sheet hung from, I forget what we hung it from. It was a pole or something. And so we showed the 3 films. As I remember, and I may be wrong, and Jackie, maybe you can correct me, there were 2 black and white films, and the third was in color. I forget which was first. I think it was an Encyclopedia Britannica, a training movie, schoolroom, sort of educational film, which, you know, was just sort of obituary or teaching. It was a British voice, very cultured, reading the script, not very interesting, about the nesting habits of a certain kind of bird. There were a lot of pictures of birds flying around and thundering about nests they made in the tops of fence posts, fence posts. Really heart-stopping stuff. At the end of that, we asked everybody, take out a sheet of paper, just write us a half a page or a page of comments, whatever you want. we were very careful not to say, well, write this way or write about that. We let them write open, just tell us how you react to that. What do you think? And they were not to put their names on the papers, just whether they were on the reflected light side, watching the image bounce off the screen, film file, or on the transmitted light side, watching the light come through the screen. That was the one difference. Reflected light or transmitted light. Something like that. We were waiting for it. You might step down to this.
You want to get standing room.
So everybody in the room saw the same film on the same screen at the same time, the same size, everything the same except which side you were on. So we collected the papers, and then we said, now if anyone wants to trade sides, you can move over to the other side, and a few did. And we showed another film. The next film, as I recall, was a U.S. Army training film on venereal disease. Black and white. More ways than one. And the same thing at the end. A few comments, half a page to a page. And just put which side of the screen you were on. And then we said, now if anybody else wants to trade sides or go back, okay, just keep the balance of male and female approximately the same on each side. And the number. So we didn't want 80 on one side and 20 on the other. Then we showed the third. The third was totally off the wall. It was called Dream of the Wild Horses. And at this time in film, there was a whole branch of filmmakers called underground film. Underground film was anything but studio. And some really crazy stuff came out of there. I remember one film by Ed Emschweller called Oh Damn Watermelons. Don't ask. It was really crazy stuff. But Dream of the Wild Horses really consisted of a bunch of horses running around on the beach, sometimes in the water and sometimes just on the sand. They'd set up a hoop, set fire to it, they made the horses go through the sewer, playing with horses in the four elements, earth, air, fire, water. This went on for 10 minutes. Oh, and the soundtrack, not a word. The first two were all spoken words. Scripted. Third one, not a single word. Instead, for soundtrack, we had some really good nightclub jazz. Nightclub jazz, horses, beach. How can you lose? And it was in color, which made a hell of a movie. So to make a long story longer, we collected all the papers and sent them off, sent the students off, and went back to Harley's place and started reading. We had two stacks, right through, right on the screen. And we read the two stacks separately, kept them separate, read them through a couple of times, and we started to see what the differences were. I won't go into detail on this. I've written it up a long time ago. But it amounted to this. The people on one side of the screen, I won't tell you which is which, were using all they've been taught about criticism, about how to approach, talk about film, how to be critical of it, how to take stock of it. They got into things like continuity, editing technique, shot selection, and so on and so on, continuity in the script. Really good film. You get the same thing in the New York Press from Clive Barnes and Judy Press, who were the top-notch critics at the time. And the people on the other side of the screen talked about themselves and how it felt and what they thought about it. They talked about symbolism in the movies. That's kind of easy with Dream of the Wild Horses. There's nothing else to talk about. They go, oh, they went crazy about color. They loved color. But symbolism in a film about birds' nests or BB, very good. And to make let me summarize it this way. One group approached film and the experience as something that happened over there, and they were being rather objective about things. The other group approached the film and the experience as an experience they had. They were concerned about the effect and the meaning of the film. The objective bunch didn't care too much about the meaning, they were being objective. Now, which side was which? What do you think? Which side was the objective side? Reflected light or transmitted light?
Reflected.
I'm sorry?
Objective is
Reflected light or objectivity? Absolutely right. Absolutely right. The film side, the reflected light side, still has objectivity. And the transmitted light side were all wrapped up in themselves, in their experience. Well, next week came, and we reported this to the students, and they shut up. We didn't have any arguments after that. So we made the point. These are different things. I should mention that I've run the thing a few times since then, in various other places. In one case, let me see, I had faculty and grad students during the summer at the University of Toronto, and we used Buster Keaton's movie, The Railroader, which is actually a pretty funny movie. Even though I said that, it's my Canadian half wants to be certain, because it's a Canadian film. And we put it on the screen, same thing, two sides. And the funny thing is, it is a comedy, and only one side of the screen is laughing. One side didn't. Which raises another question we'll get to in a minute. Now, a member of the audience, one member of the audience was a real expert on left and right brain. He was a brain surgeon, Marcel Kinsmore, from Toronto General Hospital, which was about a 10-minute walk from where we're doing this. And he was in the audience. He was on the deadpan side. And he couldn't, every so often he'd hear laughs coming from the other side of the screen. So he got up, he tiptoed around just to make sure they were watching the same thing. He couldn't believe it. Well, we made a believer out of him with that. Needless to say, of course, you may now have a sense of why television gives us a laugh track, and movies never do. You ever see a movie with a laugh track?
No.
No. You won't either. Unless it's a movie about television using laugh tracks. This was a groundbreaking experiment. It was done here at Fordham with the students and the faculty participating. And it needs to be redone now in the age of digital media as one way to explore the difference between digital media and things like television, for example. Because digital media have not only swallowed these older forms, like film and television and color TV, and all of the various formats of TV, but it's transformed them into art forms. And digital media themselves are undergoing continual transformation right now. So there's a whole range of experiments that need to be done. And I'm mentioning this to you because I know you all have very deep pockets. And I'd like to subsidize some of this work. But give it a thought. Give it a try. Some of the other things that went on, my father and my father had an operation to remove a brain tumor halfway through the proceedings. And so he was absent for a few weeks. And that was done downtown here at Columbia Presbyterian by Lester Mount, who was the premier expert in exactly this kind of operation. And he was on the operating table 24 hours straight. Teams relieving each other in shifts. John Culkin and I, Father Culkin and I, stayed throughout the whole thing. We're out in the hallway. Every so often we get published work. My father, that was a remark, and so I mentioned it. My father and Ted and Harley also got involved in a commission to design an issue of Harper's Bazaar magazine, which they did. Although my father's part at that point, he was recovering from the operation, was rather minimal. But they did a lot of work together. Ted was largely involved in executing and seeing that project through. I taught a couple of other courses. I did a course in Finnegan's Wake. Of course, the right word. We sat around and read Finnegan's Wake, looked at each other, and scratched our heads. Finnegan's Wake is basically a 625-page joke book. And along the way, all the playfulness has a very sharp edge to it. We learn a whole lot about perception of words, of language, of imagery, and about yourself. If you spend a couple of weeks playing around in Finnegan's Wake, you'll find that you become very hard to get along with. Because you can't listen to a conversation without hearing all the things that people are saying, without realizing they're saying things. They use words in a sort of casual way, but the casual way has some deep psychological, subliminal roots. And so you see into them a lot more than they want to be seen. And that's why also you get all sorts of jokes that they're not aware they're telling. It's a wonderful piece of work, and it still works very well. Once in a while I manage to get my son to sit down with me and we read a page or so. And he's not the same for the rest of the week. Of course, he's not the same from one week to another anyway. That's a private joke. It reminds me of the story of the Irishman in a bar downtown, if you like. And a fight breaks out. The Irishman gets up, goes over and taps one of the others. One of the combatants on the shoulder and said, "Pardon me, is this a private fight, or can anyone join in?" That was one of my father's favorites. I also taught a course, a short one, on high-speed reading techniques. Whenever a technology is going into obsolescence, it suddenly gets very experimental. And in the 60s, reading and literacy were getting very experimental. Reading, high-speed reading courses were all around the place. There were lots of techniques and means using stethoscopes and various kinds of technology, all of which, by the way, you can throw out because we had the proper course, the right way to do it. And that's another story. Right at the moment, if you look around you, you can see examples of this in operation. About 10 years ago, we suddenly started to invent literacies. There's now film literacy, and radio literacy, and motor car literacy, and heaven help us, all kinds of literacies. It's a sign that literacy itself is horrible. There's a Greek myth that covers this. Slay the Hydra. The Hydra was a monster in the swamp of Lerna that was terrorizing towns. But the myth held that if you cut off her head, it will kill the Hydra, but in its place, there will sprout dozens, hundreds of little ones. And that's what happened. We killed off the head of literacy, which means we killed the audience, the readership. And in its place, we have hundreds of little baby literacies. This is a general principle of obsolescence. Obsolescence doesn't mean the end of anything. It means the beginning of a new phase. So look around you. Look what's happened to cars in the last 15 years, 20 years. You don't get the great big box containers. They're gone, they're dead. in their place all kinds of novelties. And they don't give the same satisfactions as the old car. Sort of concluding observations. One, everything we predicted in 67 or 8 has come true. And there are several people here who can confirm or deny that from having been there. A second thing I would mention is the absolute importance of technique for studying perception in media, not ideas. The ideas or the idea of content is neutralized in its effectiveness by getting all the attention. It's like the bait, the worm on the hook. The fish notices the worm, samples it, tells other fish, hey, worms. They get together, they form a seminar, then pretty soon they have a conference about moral obligation to live with worms. Good worms, bad worms. Are these good for you? Maybe we should have another conference to study the moral implications of worms and vermicularity. And so, meantime, the hook does the job. T.S. Eliot said the meaning of the poem is like a choice piece of meat the burglar carries when he visits your place. To keep the dog busy. He throws it out, a nice hunk of steak, and the dog goes for that and leaves the burglar alone so that he can get to work. The meaning of a poem has that significance. Eliot said quite a number of things, contentious things. That's a very useful image because it works. It's true. And the people, there are two schools of criticism in media study. The content school and the ecology school, which ought to be looking at the media themselves, not the content, not the use, not the way it's used. The rallying cry of this group is media are neither good nor bad in themselves. It's how they are used that determines their moral significance, their goodness or their badness to society, the culture as a whole. These are the people who hold conferences about worms. These are the dogs distracted by the choice piece of meat. The other side looks at the media themselves. And medium is another word for environment. Every new technology brings with it a whole environment of supporting services and disservices. And it's that environment which everybody ignores that has a transforming effect. I like to use a very simple example, and I'll shut up. It's time to give other people a chance to talk. The one I like is the car, motor car. I just mentioned cars and changes in cars. And everybody's concerned about the car, its usefulness and so on. Nobody notices the medium of the car. Now, if you ask the question, what's the medium of the car made of? Right away you know it's not cars. Medium of the car is the road, the network. And the reorganization of cities, relations between work and living, suburbs were created. Before then you had railheads, the city, centralized city. With the car, suddenly it blew the city. And oil supplies, and engineering, and so on and so on. All the rest is the medium. And it's that that changes. It's just as true of the iPhone. What it's used for doesn't matter. What's it do? How does it rearrange your life? That's a good place to end. Thank you.
read Eric's pictures. I agree with everything Eric said, which is pretty amazing because I rarely agree with anyone completely. But I especially think when Eric said that everything that he and Marshall and the other media theorists back in 67, 68 were talking about, how everything came true, that's not hyperbole. That itself is truth. So it turns out, Donald Trump said, I think about a week or two ago, but it's hard to keep track, that he thinks, he's not sure, but maybe he came up with the term fake news. He certainly is its leading practitioner, but he certainly didn't come up with the term. And I don't know who came up with the term, but as long ago as 1969, there's a tape of Marshall McLuhan being interviewed on some Canadian television network, and there's Marshall going on about fake news. He says all broadcast news is fake. And unsurprisingly, what Marshall was saying then about fake news was far more subtle than actually even what anyone, not only Trump, has been saying about fake news recently. Because McLuhan wasn't just saying that it's false. He was saying something much more profound. He was saying that whatever you see on television is not as it actually was. And I remember the first time I began thinking about that, you know, Walter Cronkite used to end his broadcast, and that's the way it was. And look, I loved Walter. He was great. He looked like my wife's father, so that was a good thing also. And he was a very honest person. In a Gallup poll in the 70s, he was chosen the most trusted man in America. But he was not telling the truth when he said, and that's the way it was. A more accurate rendition would have been, and that's the way a small group of editors and CBS News thought you should think it was. But you can understand why Walter didn't want to say that. It was not a good but that's what McLuhan was talking about. And that's still true today. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't trust these media, but we need to appreciate them for what they are. You know, the New York Times says all the news that's fit to print. It's really, again, all the news that a small group of editors decided might be deemed fit to print. So, okay, we'll print it and we'll decide whether to put it on page 1 or 10 or on the top or the bottom of the film. So that was 1969 when Marshall McLuhan said that. And if you go back 5 years, 1964, the book Understanding Media that Eric mentioned, which came out actually the same year that the Beatles hit big, and I'm getting back to the Beatles. There's a great chapter in that book in which Marshall McLuhan talks about the Greek myth. And Eric told you about one Greek myth. McLuhan loved to apply Greek myths to our present age. And in this case, he was talking about the Greek myth regarding Narcissus. And he wrote a little chapter called Narcissus, Narcosis. I'm sure most of you have heard the story. I won't repeat it at great length, but the gist of it is this was an incredibly good-looking young man who pretty much fell in love with his own reflection. And his favorite pastime was looking into pools of water and gazing wistfully at himself. And some Greek nymphs came by and tried to interest him in other things, but nope, Narcissus was just totally engaged in looking at his reflection. And by the way, there are several endings to that story. My favorite one is he was so much in love with his own reflection that he tried to reach into the water and get it and fell in and drowned. It's a little apocalyptic, but that's, you know, something that McLuhan back in 1964 was able to say when we watch television. We're really looking at our own reflections. We're not literally seeing ourselves, but we see ourselves in what we see in our media. And that's why it's so engrossing. Well, that sounds very familiar because you hear people today talking about news bubbles, right? And they tend to blame Facebook and Twitter. We surround ourselves with news that just reinforces our own opinions. That's true enough. But it didn't begin with Facebook and Twitter. It began long before that, and McLuhan was talking about it in 1964. And you can go back 2 years before that to the Gutenberg Galaxy, and this, of course, is one of Marshall McLuhan's most famous ideas or concepts or percepts or whatever you feel comfortable calling it. You've all heard about it, the global village. So in 1962, there was the Telstar satellite that was launched. That's probably what got Marshall McLuhan thinking about that. But there wasn't much of a global village. In fact, there was no global village in 1962. There were national groups that watched television, but they weren't villages. Because in a village, people interact. But the people who watched television in 1962, all they were doing was watching. They weren't communicating. So it was really a village of voyeurs. Almost, if you want to get like into horror movies, a village of the damned. But again, you don't have to get that apocalyptic either. But the point about that is, here is McLuhan writing this in 1962. And if you look at the age we live in now, and have lived in for the third couple of decades already, that is a global village. We put the announcement of this event up on Facebook, and in addition to all of you good people who came here, 100 or 150 people said they were interested. And those people, for the most part, don't live in New York. If they did say they were interested and live in New York, I'm going to keep track of the fact that they didn't come. But most people couldn't get here. But if you look at Facebook, it is an embodiment of the global village. But my favorite of Marshall McLuhan's tools, and it's tough to choose because the light on, light through, that's great. When you begin to understand McLuhan's ideas, you're like a kid in a candy shop because everything is fascinating. But my favorite has always been the tetrad. And if you're talking about predicting, the tetrad has in it, in its four-part structure, at that fourth part of the structure, literally something that points at the future. So let's do a tetrad on television, which was the big deal in the 1960s and 70s. First part of the tetrad is it amplifies or enhances something. What does television amplify or enhance? Well, immediate audio-visual communication. What does it obsolescence? Radio. Television replaced radio. Jack Benny moved from radio to television. Had a little bit of a problem because he was getting pretty old already, and that's when he started saying, I'm 39, I'm 39, when he was like 109. Nobody knew what he looked like on radio, but he had a very successful television show. By the way, as Eric correctly pointed out, and as I'll get to in a couple of minutes, this didn't mean that radio was dead. Not at all. It just meant that radio had been pushed into the background. That's what obsolescence is. Or to use the Gestalt psychology term, television pushed radio from figure into ground. The third part of the tetrad is it retrieves something which previously had been pushed into the background. And in the case of television, it retrieved the audio-visual mode of communication. But the most interesting part of the tetrad, I always thought, was the fourth part. And it went under several names. Sometimes it was called reversal. sometimes McLuhan liked to say, television flipped into something else. If you think about the tetrad as a wheel, you can think of it as a rolling of the wheel. So what did television flip into? Well, back in the 70s, when I first became aware of the tetrad, and this is one of the fun things about the tetrad, you can have all kinds of possibilities that you plug into its structure. So back in the 1970s, what was television going to flip into? Well, one possibility was holography, right? Two-dimensional television becomes three-dimensional. Guess what? That didn't happen. And I was actually talking about that, so unlike Eric and Marshall, and those people back in the 60s, that was a prediction that still hasn't happened. But another possibility was the sort of regimentation, the almost dictatorial television by appointment that network television insisted upon in those days. Well, cable television overthrew that. And so traditional network television burst into cable television. And many other things as well. You could say that television reversed into the internet, which is another kind of swing. In fact, Neil Postman, who was my dissertation advisor at NYU, didn't like the internet because he thought it was a kind of television. I always try to tell him, well, it's related to television, but it's not television, because it's what television has flipped into. In 2003, I realized that something very significant was happening again with television. And my daughter Molly is here in the audience. I feel like Donald Trump introducing but in the fall of 2003, one day Molly says to me, hey Dad, did you hear about this show Alias? I don't know how many of you have heard of Alias. It was Jennifer Garner's first big show. Great series on conventional network television. I think it was ABC. And so Molly said to me, hey, you know, this is a really good show. You might like it. But there was a problem with my liking it, and that's because in 2003, Alias was beginning its third season. So who wants to, like, start reading a book in the middle? Well, here is one of the ways I use my professorship at Fordham University for better or worse. I wrote an email to, I guess, the publicity people at ABC. I said, hey, I'm doing a study on Alias. Sure enough, when I was later, I get like every single episode of Alias. By the way, just to show you how honorable I am, I did actually write an article on Alias, and it's published in the Smart Pop series of books on natural culture. It was about 2 years later. But I didn't know I was going to write my own. What I discovered then, and I didn't 100% realize it, but it was the beginning of my realizing this, is that television had flipped into, reversed into something very profound and unexpected. And we have a name for it today. We call it binge watching. And sometimes used in a derogatory way. I don't think there's anything wrong with binge watching. As a matter of fact, again, apropos what Eric was saying regarding literacy and books, what binge watching does is it makes television more like a book. Because think about it, if you pick up a novel, like, say, one of my novels, The Plot to Save Socrates, pick that up, that'll show what it's about. And you start reading it. You decide when you stop getting the story, right? You can stay up all night and read the whole thing. That's a good idea. Then you can get another one of my novels and keep doing it. Or you can stop after a couple of chapters and then come back to it the next day or a couple of weeks later. In other words, you, the consumer, have complete control over the pace. network television didn't allow that. The VCR began to allow it if you were able to record a whole series, but it was cumbersome. By 2003, you could begin to get DVDs in video stores, and pretty soon after, Netflix began. And so now for the first time, if you discovered a television series, you could see it, you could read the television series as you would a book. And so, whether it's House of Cards on Netflix, whether it's The Man on the High Castle, In the High Castle, on Amazon, there are dozens of these series. More than dozens, there are probably hundreds now. And what they are books. So I began realizing that in 2003. But I'm the kind of person, I don't like just thinking about something, putting a, mark in a column, checking it off. Okay, television is now reversed into binge watching. I like to keep the process going. So for the last couple of years, I've been thinking about what is binge watching going to reverse into. So this brings us to this past May, okay, May 2007. I'm driving up to Cape Cod in my new Prius, which I got only because my old Prius died, because I'm an incredible cheapskate. And not only that, in this new Prius, there is Sirius XM radio, which was there free. They give it to you free for 3 months. Now, you might ask, why did I get this earlier? Again, my point about being an incredible cheapskate. And I've actually been on Sirius XM radio interview, but I didn't feel like paying for it. I guess I could have listened to them again, pulled out the old professor. Think of it. Anyhow, here I am. It's the end of May. I'm driving up to Cape Cod. And I've been listening for the last 3 or 4 days, not to MSNBC, which is what I first started listening to, being such a devoted professor, wanting to stay up on the news. But I heard that there was a new channel, the Beatles channel, that was going to be playing nothing but Beatles music, 24 hours a day. Not only Beatles music, but various shows about the Beatles, Peter Asher's, from Me to You, Peter Asher, Peter and Fordham, who did World Without Love. Dennis Elsis, who is a disc jockey at our own WFEV-FM. He has a great show, The Fab Four. So I was just listening to this. And then I heard this on the radio. I can't tell you how I feel. My heart is like a wheel. Let me roll it. That, in case you didn't recognize was Paul McCartney's song with Wings in 1973. It was the flip side of his better-known hit, Jet. And I realized the moment that I heard that play, that I was witnessing, actually ear-witnessing, the flip of the tetrad. It was rolling into something else. Binge watching television had rolled into binge listening satellite radio. Now that might sound like a superficial point, or Levinson is just so crazy about the Beatles, letting that mix into his theory. That's true. But there is something I think very significant about binge listening in contrast to binge watching. For example, what's the longest stretch that we could watch on television? Well, it depends how you do the accounting. I Love Lucy has been around since the 1950s, and you can watch I Love Lucy now, so that's a pretty long stretch. But how many years was I Love Lucy? 3 or 4 or 5 years? 3 years, right? And then it was like the Lucy show, and then she broke up with Desi, and so it wasn't that long. Lucy, 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 it was only on for a few years, so if you try to binge watch Lucy, you're going to get the same thing over and over. All right, well, let's look at it another way. What about Star Trek? Star Trek begins in the mid-60s, TOS, as it's called in the industry, the original series. Then there's Star Trek: The Next Generation, Rachel, then a whole bunch of other series, movies. CBS just came out with a new Star Trek series, Discovery, but I haven't seen it beyond the original because, again, CF cheapskate. I don't feel like paying for the new service is enough for me. So Star Trek has gone a long way, but if you binge watch Star Trek, you're going to get not only different episodes, which would be the equivalent of different songs, but you get different actors, right? It's not the same. William Shatner did not appear in every Star Trek episode throughout all the series and the movies. No one has. But now let's look at binge listen to radio in the case of the Beatles channel. On the Beatles channel, you can hear Paul McCartney not only singing the song that I just sang, but you can hear him and the other Beatles back when they were the choirmen in the late 1950s. You can hear everything through the 1960s, their early songs, what happened when they began to get more serious songs like Nowhere Man, when they went into their psychedelic era. You can hear what happens when the Beatles break up. And indeed, you can hear Paul McCartney literally singing at one of his concerts in the last couple of months. That to me is a very profound development. And then there's also this. The ear, the acoustic mode, is something which Marshall McLuhan, Tony Schwartz, who John Carey is going to talk to you about, and savvy people who have studied media have long realized, in one way or another, shapes everything else. There is something very profound about the way sound reaches our brain. It's a very different way than the way light reaches our brain. What happens with light is it excites an optic nerve and gets to our brains. What happens with sound is there's literally eardrums in both of our ears, and they vibrate. And that's how it gets to our brains. And that vibration is not just an incidental thing. So sound shapes us. And one of the things that Marshall McLuhan and Tony Schwartz like to say is that television itself treats the eye as if it were an ear, because television is all around, just like sound is all around us, and many other characteristics of television. But here I am talking about Tony Schwartz when we have somebody on our panel, John Carey, who knows far more about Tony Schwartz than I do. Because John, as you know, was here in 67 and 68. He was not only a student at Marshall McLuhan's seminars at Fordham, but he went down to Tony Schwartz's studio in Manhattan, a really magical place. I was lucky enough to be there once. And when you walked into that studio, you literally felt like it was a scene out of a movie, like you were going into like the inner sanctum of somehow people who understood what was going on. John Carey is also a professor here at Fordham, a professor of communication and media management, which is actually a sibling of the Department of Communication and Media Studies. We're the older sibling. They came up with the name management, by the way, because they were hoping if somebody were listing departments in alphabetical order, that Department of Communication and Media Management would be listed first. But it wasn't John's fault, I'm sure. Who can we blame it on? Dennis, maybe, I don't know. Anyhow, with that, let me finish up my talk and welcome John Carey to our stage.
I'm here to talk about the responsive chord, but in order to do that, I have to talk about his author, Tony Schwartz. And I know some of you know him and some don't. For my money, he was one of the most powerful communicators in the 20th century. He lived right around the corner here, on 56th Street, just off 10th Avenue. He taught at Fordham, but that's I'm ahead of the story. I just want to briefly give you a sense of his career in 4 phases, which overlap quite a bit. The first has to do with folk music, and he's collecting it from people all over the world, and he's working with poor folk singers at the time, Harry Belafonte, Pete Seeger, and he's preparing tapes so they can take them to the studios and try and get a contract. His next phase is sort of soundscapes. He produced over a dozen records about really the city of New York, and he took ordinary things and made them extraordinary. It could be children playing a game. It could be the zookeeper. It could be someone selling pens on the street. But he brought them alive. So these are some of his records. He had an album about taxi drivers. Mundo is probably the most famous street musician in the history. And he did about a dozen records like this. So this is sort of phase 2. Then he's starting to get into the commercial world. And at first, he's very well known for using children in commercials. Now, what you need to know is, up until this time, they didn't use children in commercials. They used women pretending to be children because they thought you couldn't direct children. And Tony said, what's the problem? So he became famous for a while as just that, this specialist who could direct children. But that's like an early part of his work. Now, another thing I have to tell you about his work, he was very influenced by posters. He worked for the armed forces during World War II, creating posters. And then he worked for a very famous French poster artist after the war. Now, what does a poster do? It takes simple but powerful visuals and attaches a message to them. And what he did in his most famous commercials was to use a simple but powerful visual and then let the sound do the work to grab you and move you in a certain direction. So he had, for example, one of his most famous commercials was a Coca-Cola commercial, and all it was a Coca-Cola bottle, a glass of Coca-Cola. And all the sound was coming from his class in the Dalton School, which is another thing I need to tell you about him. He rarely used actors. He did use announcers, because announcers were not like anything in the real world. But for characters in a commercial, why would you have an actor playing a postman when you can have a real postman being a postman? And so most of his people in his commercials were real. They were postmen, they were barbers, they were kids, they were real people. And that was part of the power of his communication. This too. And by this time, he's moved past just children, and he's doing commercials for some of the most powerful big companies in the US. And he has, Paul alluded to it, he had this basement studio. It was in the basement of a townhouse. It is hard to convey what it was like. It was very small, maybe 12 by 15. He had the best equipment in the world. The sound was sound you probably never heard, and I've never heard anything like it. So the moguls of Madison Avenue are coming into his basement studio, and they're there because many of them are like the Mad Men episode people. They think he's going to make them even more money, and he did, because he won award after award. What was really amusing about it was these people in their, I guess then it was a $500 suit, and they had been at the 21 the day before with the 3 martini lunch, and they come into Tony's studio and they get a hero sandwich and a soft drink from Rocco's sandwich shop around the corner. And it's a totally different world, but they actually loved it because it was so different. I'm going to show you two examples of his work at the end. Okay, so his first commercial in politics, he hadn't done any political commercials. And the Doyle Dane Burnback group that was doing Johnson's campaign said to him, you know, could you do a political commercial? And he said, I have it. It's over here on the shelf. Because he had actually done it, a version of it for the United Nations 2 years earlier. So this was the famous Daisy commercial, which I think many of you know. It was only played once, and it went viral. And a lot of the concepts we talk about today, social media, viral media, he was doing all of it. So it plays once, it's considered by some the most powerful commercial, it's also considered by some the most infamous commercial. And the big point about it was, he's talking about, all right, how does the commercial work? You see a little girl and she's picking daisies, and she's counting, and she miscounts 3, 7, 5, then it gets up to 9, and now it zooms in on her eye, and it's the countdown for an atomic blast. Now what's interesting about this, Johnson said, is supposed to have said it won the campaign for him. I'm not so sure that he needed this, he would have won anyway. But the big thing is, this had an enormous impact about Gold War. The thing is, it never mentions Gold War. And the principle involved here is really the core of what we're going to get at with the responsive chord. He was using feelings that people already had. He was just drawing them out. People had those feelings about Goldwater. They saw this, the little girl, the atomic bomb, my God, and so all of their negative feelings about Goldwater emerged. The Republicans cried foul, but it was played again and again and again by the news agencies. Now, okay, I have a couple of things here. The most powerful politicians in the world, this is Jimmy Carter taking a break watching television between takes. Ted Kennedy, he did dozens of senatorial and gubernatorial campaigns, 5 presidential campaigns. I was there for a lot of them. The most powerful campaign he did, the candidate lost. And it's not written in the history books at all, but I'm going to tell you it. It was the campaign for Humphrey against Nixon. Now, what you have to remember is it's 1968. Everything is going against the Democrats. Martin Luther King is assassinated. The anti-war movement drives Johnson out of the White House. Looks like Robert Kennedy's going to get it. He's assassinated. The Democratic convention turns into a riot. Humphrey is the last man standing. Everyone else has been wiped out. It's Labor Day. And he's 24 points behind in the polls against Nixon. Okay, so, and then the main thing that's going to happen now is the commercials, which Tony is doing, and actually his wife Rena is their principal writer. Come election day, Humphrey lost by 0.3%. So he moved the electorate almost 24 points in 8 weeks. But as they say, history is a version of things written by the winner. So Joe McGinnis wrote the book about the Great Nixon campaign. In fact, it was a disaster. Okay, so now we come to, well, there's one more phase, which is it's out of sync. A phase in which Tony is doing a lot of nonprofit stuff, educational stuff. He's in tremendous demand as a lecturer. He writes 2 books. And once again, these powerful people are coming to his studio. Carl Sagan, the Surgeon General Koop, Huntley from NBC, Bill Moyers, name after name after name. They're coming to see what he has to say. What is he up to? What is he doing? So now we come to Fordham and McLuhan and Tony. Okay, Tony met McLuhan in 1965. So he knew McLuhan when they were both working here at Fordham. And he was part of this Schweitzer team. John Culkin deserves enormous credit for putting this together. So that's Holly Parker, and that's Ted Carpenter, and that's Marshall, and Tony is down here. Now, McLuhan had an enormous impact on Tony Schwartz.
Give him a call. So
Up until that time,
and as you're doing these things, sort of feeling someone out, what you could do
And I said, well,
McLuhan
I
gave him
worked
concepts,
Tony Schwartz
gave
early
him
on,
vocabulary,
and he said, the
and he
response
gave him
for Tony
confidence.
Schwartz.
And he said his work was not
And he
just
said,
powerful,
that
but
was
important.
required reading.
So
everyone
now
in the
Tony
communication
blossoms,
of the
and he
Obamas.
writes these books, and he's now explaining things that other people are going to be using,
Now,
not just him.
what's the core principle?
So here he is in the studio
model of
with
communication
Marshall
back
and
in the
John
day.
Culkin.
And
I
I think
was
it
lucky
actually
enough
came out of
with a
studies
couple of
about
other people
transatlantic
to be part of this.
1940s.
At the end of the year, I gave him a job. And
There was a model of how to
several
move
years actually
information.
after that.
So I want to, how does communication work?
This is how I remember.
I
it.
have something
The
I want
studio
to communicate
was just
with
an
wired
idea
with something
on
like
tape
that.
and
I've got to put it into
headphones
form,
and
words
words
or pictures or sound.
But then you went in at
Then
first
you have
and
to
it was
find a
like,
medium.
what the hell is going
Say
on
a
here?
letter,
And then you realize what the hell is going on.
Either video or even word of mouth.
Okay, so we
And
come to
then
this
I've got to
last
move
report,
that information.
and
And as I move that
what its
information,
contribution is.
noise can come into the
And
channel.
the fact that it was written
Could be
4
static
decades
as a
ago.
broadcast signal.
But I believe,
Could be
and others
people
do,
aren't
that
paying
it's very
attention.
modern.
Lots of sources
And
of
I'll give you a
noise.
story.
So this message
they
comes to
can be
someone who's
evidence
receiving
that
it,
it's much
and the
more.
question is, do they
2
get
years
the
ago,
meaning
I got a
that
call
was
from a
intended
guy.
by the person sending
He's the
it?
chief technologist
And Tony said,
for Obama's
he
White
totally
House.
rejected this.
And
as
he
a
wanted to
total
go
transportation
into
model of
business by
communication.
himself.
His
And in this
model
crazy
was
world of who knows who,
that
he calls
create,
David Talakoff
stimuli
as Bill O'Reilly's
that
executive
would give
director.
people.
And O'Reilly says to him, oh, what you want to do is what John
memories,
Carey did a few
about,
years ago. Give him a call. So he gives me a call.
When they,
And as you're doing these
person
things, sort
receiving
of
those
feeling someone out, what
We're
did you
gonna
do,
create
what did
a
you do?
message with you.
And I said, well,
You as the
I
communicator
worked for this
are
guy,
not
Tony
sending
Schwartz,
some
early
package
on.
to them.
And he said,
You're
you're
just
responsible
delivering
for
certain
Schwartz.
things, and they with you
Yeah.
create the message.
And he said,
Now,
that's
especially
what's
if you're interested in
required
persuasion,
for everyone.
that's really important because if I'm contributing to the
And
message,
the cornerstone-
there's a greater chance I'm going to believe the message because I helped
Now,
now.
what's the core principle?
Okay, that's the core concept. Now, I
There was
just
a
want to
model
tell you, I
of
hope it's working.
communication back in the day.
2 examples.
And I think it
That
actually came
illustrate
out
this
of
notion of
studies about
responsive
transatlantic
chord.
phone calls in the
I
1940s.
don't want to
But that's neither here
tell
nor
you
there.
something. I want to strike a responsive chord.
There was a model
so
of
that
how you
will
move
join me
information.
in the message.
So,
And
how
you're-
how
and
does
Daisy was a
communication
perfect
work?
example of that.
I have something, I want
Most
to
of the
communicate,
meaning
I
of
have
the
an
Daisy
idea,
was in
something like
people's
that.
heads and their feelings.
I've got to put it into a form.
Okay, let's see if this
Words,
works.
pictures, or sound. Then I have to find a medium, say a letter, or a movie, or TV, or radio, or even word of mouth. And then I've got to move that information. And as I move that information,
Okay,
noise can come into the
first
channel.
one, they're both radio
Could be
commercials.
static as in a broadcast.
First one
signal.
is for Bosco.
Could be people aren't paying
I don't know if
attention.
Bosco's still
Lots of
exists.
sources. So this message comes from someone who's and the question is, do they get the meaning
Piece of
that was
very
intended by the
very
person
end
sending
that
it?
I cut out.
And Tony
Very
said,
beginning, it's
he just
a
totally
woman saying,
rejected this.
Johnny, come get
as
your
a
Bosco.
sort of
And you're going to hear
transportation
this.
model of
And at the
communication.
very end, the announcer says
His
something
model
like,
was
Bosco
that
makes milk taste
we
better.
create
Okay, so what I
stimuli,
want to see is, because this
that we
evokes
give
something
to
from
people.
a memory name.
and that evokes things from you. It evokes feelings, it evokes memories, it evokes attitudes. And so when the person receiving those stimuli are going to create the message with you. You as the communicator are not sending some package to them. You're just delivering certain things and they with you create the message. Now, especially if you're interested in persuasion, that's really important because if I'm contributing to the message, there's a greater chance I'm going to believe the message because I helped to create it. Okay, that's the core concept. Now, I just want to play, I hope it's working, 2 examples that illustrate this notion of a responsive chord. That's the name of the book. I don't want to tell you something, I want to strike a responsive chord so that you will join me in the message. And Daisy was a perfect example of that. Most of the meaning in the Daisy was in people's heads and their feelings. Okay, let's see if this is working. Okay, first one, they're both radio commercials. First one is for Bosco. I don't know if people remember, I don't know if Bosco still exists. Does it exist? Okay, chocolate syrup. So, there's a piece at the very beginning and the very end that I've cut out. The very beginning is a woman saying,
Johnny, come get your Bosco. Then you're going to hear this. And at the very end, the announcer says something like, Bosco makes milk taste better. Okay, so what I want to see is, does this evoke something from you, a memory maybe? The final line, which is essentially Bosco's going to make it better, but he's working with a childhood memory maybe of you, or a memory of your children, and it gets your attention, and then B, it probably gives you certain feelings of nostalgia. Okay, the second one. What year was that? That would have been in the 60s. The second one is for the movie Woodstock. Now, Tony had something he called mnemonic sound, where he would overlay, he wanted to get more information than you could, let's say, in 30 seconds or 60 seconds, so he would overlay it. And I'm going to play this thing for Woodstock. You're going to hear the names of 20 artists in less than 10 seconds. Now, it's not speeded up, instead it's overlaid. Now, I play this in my class all the time. I use a lot of this book in my class. If you know the names of these artists, you will hear their names. So a lot of people in this room may hear them. If you're 20-something and you only know a few of them, you hear those, but you don't pretty much hear the others. So we can take what you know in your head, and if that knowledge of the name was there, you fill it in.
Respond to it.
She laughed and talked a lot with new people on the block, but always at evening time.
Joan Baez, Country Joe, Crosby, Still, Nash, Bianchi, Jimi Hendrix, Santana, John Sebastian, Shannon Swire, and years at Stone, The Who. They're all in Woodstock, the movie from Warner Brothers, with a little help from our friend Woodstock.
Did you hear the names?
All right.
That was easy.
Now, Paul was talking about XM Radio. I worked for XM Radio in the early days. Did a lot of work for them. The head of programming, who knew I worked for Tony, and knew about this technique, said, do you by any chance have an example of it? Because we want to do it because we have so many names of channels. So I gave him this, and he came back later and he said, it's not working. I gave it to 4 editors, none of them could do it. And what it gets at is, it's not a mechanical thing. Tony had this incredible skill as an editor. And it's sort of, you don't think about that, but he was. Okay, last example is an answer. He did a lot of things for against smoking, against the war, for fire safety. He had what I think was an extraordinary commercial, I don't have it, for against smoking. Now, many commercials against smoking, they tell you about the terrible things that smoking is going to do to you. This is different. It's 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and they're dressing up like their parents. And they're playing, is this how daddy wears his hat? Is this how mommy puts her scarf on? And the announcer comes in as they're still playing. It's a television commercial. And he says, children love to imitate their parents. Children learn by imitating their parents. Do you smoke cigarettes? No. So, in other words, it's not you who are going to get hurt, it's your kids. Okay, I've said enough. I'm done.
All right, we're now going to submit to your questions.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Wonderful presentation tonight, gentlemen. I thought I had to be here. I'm a graduate of the University of Toronto and also the Fordham Preparatory School at Rose Hill, so I thought I would really combine the 2 institutions tonight. And the question is for Eric. Eric, how did New York and that year shape Marshall? We know that he, obviously, through Understanding Media and other works, very well known in the United States, but in 1967, he came to the media capital of the world. And how did that shape his career and later work? And great to have you here in New York. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. That's a real poser. You think. He found himself surrounded by people that he'd been observing from a distance. And it was a completely different kind of experience. He always said it was a wonderful thing to live in a backward country. Canada, because he could look over the fence, you see, and see what his neighbors were up to. Much more clearly than people involved in it see himself. And sometimes get outside. Now he found himself on the inside, looking out. And he learned an enormous amount. Quite a lot from Tony Schwartz, of course. They had a huge number of conversations, and Tony wasn't at all subtle about it. Anybody who came into his house, the house was wired, and he was stationed from the moment you entered until you left. He learned a lot from people in advertising. He'd been observing advertising and advertisers from a distance. The Canadian industry was somewhat in its infancy. Then the ad men in New York were very sophisticated. In fact, he got teamed up with one, Gene Schwartz, who ran Information Incorporated, and they started a newsletter for businessmen called the View Line newsletter, because Canada had a string of radar stations up in the north called the Distant Early Warning Line, the View Line. And the idea was they were listening for anything the Russians would send over the top of the world in this direction. And he thought of his own media study as being a kind of View Line. Use my techniques and you can see stuff coming, but other people won't. And so he had a chance to test some of those things and watch their operation close up. Other than that, New York was, well, heck, it's New York, it's excitement. He met all kinds of people. We had Jack Parr as a neighbor from the Bronxville area and went over to his place a few times. He had a great admiration for Steve Allen and learned a huge amount from a little innocent book Steve wrote called The Funny Man. And it opens with, or very early in the book, the line, "The funny man is a man with a grievance," which it doesn't take much thinking to say, oh yeah, and no kidding. Things like, now take my wife, please. I don't need to tell you who that is. And the Irishman joke I told earlier, straight grievance. Some of them are very complex. But he said at one point while he was here that part of the solution to the problems that the English and the French were having could be ameliorated if they'd start telling French jokes. Would take the edge off. And it's quite true, people will do that. You might keep that in mind right now, about things going on around us here. The comedians don't find some of this stuff funny at all. But it's the very things that aren't funny that you have to play with. When you're really uptight, when you're really afraid of something or disturbed by it, you can't play. And part of regaining sanity is getting playback. I once had, now I'm way off topic, sorry. I once had a roommate who had just been released from a mental institution, and he was back in circulation. And I often told jokes with him, and it was funny to watch his reactions, because he'd be watching me and waiting for the cue that this is where you laugh. He'd forgotten how to laugh, forgotten how to play. He was mad in both senses. They're close to each other. But that sort of thing, that kind of observation was made possible by being here, and of course by association with John Culkin, who was deeply involved in film, not just as theory, but he knew a whole lot of people in Hollywood, and I was on a first-name basis with him. In fact, he introduced me to a film conference once as, "Ladies and gentlemen, son of Tarzan." I don't know what else to say. Let's try somebody else.
Yeah, but I just want to say one quick thing, though. It reminds me of my favorite line in Marshall's book, Take Today, the Executive as Dropout, which is that the only people who have proof of their sanity are those who have been discharged from mental institutions. Questions? Yeah, yes, right there. You, right? Yeah.
Hi, I'm in media now, and I studied Marshall a little bit in grad school in the early 2000s. I was wondering what any of you thought he might think of the way media is distributed nowadays. So many articles by different media sources are translated to readers through social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever it might be. And you don't necessarily know who the source is, you just see a headline. What would he think about that? The fact that the source is becoming ever more anonymous.
Well, I've come at it from a slightly different angle. The fact that he talked about the fact that we were in a global village, that essentially we were all getting the same thing, and that meant we were one village even though we were the world. And I think the internet has totally shattered that. We're not in a global village anymore. We're in a million isolated villages of our own choosing. And I think he would observe that if he were here.
I think actually both are true. I think we are in a global village, but again, we tend to surround ourselves with things that agree with what we already believe. But I would also add, because I hear implied in your question, you're wondering if McLuhan might make a value judgment about it and be concerned about it. And I always like to point out, whether or not this was true or not, McLuhan would always say, he said to me dozens of times, he wrote this, that he was not making judgments one way or another as to whether things were good or bad. He was merely exploring, he wasn't explaining, he was probing, he was not judging.
Well, add one thing to that, because I remember this very well. He said, don't take everything I say as gospel. A lot of what I say, I'm just testing the waters, and I may disagree with myself a week later. And think. He said, think of what I'm doing as probes.
Yep, they call them probes. Yep.
To your point, let me quote something that Ted Carpenter, the anthropologist, would remark about primitive art. He said, primitive art is never silent. Anonymous, he said, equals unanimous. When it's anonymous, then it's a function of everybody. Everybody produces.
I like that.
Yes.
In the late 1960s, Stan Freberg, the radio writer, did a devastating imitation of Marshall McLuhan. I think it was a radio commercial, maybe it was one of his routines. I wondered what Marshall thought of it. And then also around 1967, Columbia issued a recording, and I wondered whether you had a part in the recording and you could tell us a little about it.
Two things. He thought the Freeburg thing was hilarious and very annoying. I had very little to do with the actual producer of that record, the LP. It was called Medium is the Massage. And after the book, and it was produced by Jerry H. Altman, the same crowd that produced the book, I had very little to do with it. I observed a couple of recording sessions. And I was on the sidelines when Mac was looking at the script. Well, I think that answers the question.
Did it have his imprimatur?
Oh, well, yeah, he participated.
Question? Bob?
So although you said that McLuhan was not professing the truth, he was probing and so forth. It was enormously comforting, it still is, 50 years later, to have that kind of ethnographic, ethnographer from Mars point of view that he had. About 5 years ago, Sarah Fishko, who produces a series for NPR about various personalities and ideas from the 20th century, spoke to my class at Pratt where I teach. And I asked her, and some of the students asked her, said, who was the McLuhan of, at that time it was 2010 or 2012? And she said, I don't know. I don't think there is anybody. I mean, is there a McLuhan equivalent or some version of that comforting probe-like voice or voices?
No, they can't, it's ipso facto impossible for there to be another McLuhan because...
Hey, wait a minute.
But Eric McLuhan is Marshall McLuhan's son, and so Eric was influenced by all kinds of things that Marshall McLuhan did. And since Marshall McLuhan wasn't Marshall McLuhan's son, he couldn't have had that same influence. So I think there's a sort of mania in the popular media to try to find who is the current, but there isn't. There was one Sigmund Freud, there was one Karl Marx, there was one Marshall McLuhan. And I think that's great. Just like there was just one the Beatles. Lonnie.
Harvey.
Harvey, sorry.
The community is a village. We are in a global village. I came all the way from Atlanta as a result of seeing your announcement on Facebook. And when I was a junior in college, way back in the 1970s, I was always fascinated by his influence that the media is a message. And I'm just wondering, I've wondered all of my life since then. What would he think of? What is the message of this social media glut of information that we seem to have? What would you say that message is to people?
Well, the message is the effect it has. And so if you want to know the message of social media, look at the effect that it has on the people involved in it, which is everybody. One way to find out the effect, and there are a number of ways of studying media, that is, environments. One way is suddenly, abruptly take it away. What would happen if, as of midnight, some wicked witch of the West waved your wand and every single piece of technology involved in social media were obliterated? You got up in the morning and none of it was there. What would change? The distance between where you are and where you will be then is the event. What would happen if we suddenly got rid of the motor car? All of them, every single one. We have a lot of empty parking lots, roads that aren't getting used, air pollution. And think of the political implications. All of that would rearrange itself. We'd live in a different culture. That's one way to study media, and that's a very good one.
I agree. I think it is a good one. I'm just going to add, unlike Marshall McLuhan, I do make value judgments. I think it's a useful thing to do. And I think, by and large, the impact of social media has been beneficial, notwithstanding Trump. But you can no more blame Trump on social media than you can blame Nixon on television. And the fact is, it's much more complex than that. And as a matter of fact, I think social media have in their great communicative capacity to let every single person here in the audience, any place in the world, become a producer, the most democratizing possibilities of any media system in history. But we've yet to see it happen.
The only thing I'd add to that, which sort of is disagreeing, I think what Paul is saying is correct. But one of the academic question is to throw, that was a great question, but another question is, why is so much social media negative? I've been at meetings where, like, the head of news for NBC said 80% of the social media comments about NBC News are negative, and they're really negative and they're really nasty. One of the things that's happening in a small way, we get these evaluations at the end of the term,
when they were on physical paper, they were relatively mild. You know, they liked it or they didn't like it. They might say, well, the professor is spending too much time on small detail. Now, if they don't like it, they say, boring. Can't this guy talk about something of interest to me? So there's this amplification and negative quality that's in a lot of social media, and I don't know why.
Question, yes.
Hi. This is really for anybody. We were talking earlier about the binge watching and the binge listening, as you said. In the 1980s, when Sony introduced the Betamax, Jack Valenti, who was then the head of the MPAA, got in a lot of trouble because he said that the Betamax technology was to the American movie producer what the Boston Strangler was to the woman home alone. That didn't go over well. And the fear with Jack and the American movie producer is the same fear that the network executives had with binge watching and business binge listening, which is control, giving the viewers and the listeners more control. And I was wondering how that increase, and not even increase, but need for control, necessity for control affects the environment as opposed to when we didn't have that control 40 years ago.
I think there's, oh, go ahead.
What I want to point out about that, because I've studied this fairly carefully, networks or really any large organizations like to have control. They have a lot of trouble with serendipity. And what happened then was mom and pop video cassette rental shops emerged, and the networks and the film distributors couldn't control it. So what did they do? They tried to kill it. Now, and ultimately they lost the big court decision about the first sale doctrine. They made tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in spite of what they tried to kill.
Yeah, there's a perpetual struggle, as you're pointing out, between what the people who produce entertainment and sell entertainment and news do and what consumers of those products want. And I consider our current age to be the best victory so far. It's not a complete victory in that never-ending battle. So, as far as binge watching television, I think it's great that Netflix and Amazon are exceeding HBO and Showtime in viewers in some cases, just as I was delighted to see HBO and Showtime exceed NBC and CBS. And for that reason, I think Sirius XM radio, it's no coincidence that it happened there. It didn't happen on AM radio or FM radio. So it's part of an evolution of media, and I think it's by and large a healthy thing. Yes?
Hi. So I guess I'll stand up for it. I think it's in the book Culture is Our Business, where Marshall, whoever wrote the book with, writes that the late 19th century politics was governed mostly by the Pennsylvania and New York Central Railroads, whereas in the 60s we can expect that to be the new political parties to be NBC and ABC or whatever. My question to you is, do you think the same is true in 2010 to now with maybe Verizon, AT&T, which mediate most communication? That's my question.
What do you think?
Would you like me to answer that?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Anything other than we...
Sure. I mean, I think maybe Facebook, Twitter, social media is the content, whereas the transmission of data, through 5G networks, etc., is the message. Stored memory and sitting on servers all over the world, retrievable precisely, seems to be the message.
All right, good answer. One last question.
I didn't mean to. Sorry.
I tell you what, we'll have two last questions. I don't care if we go over 9 o'clock. Okay, first to come with
One comment: has it occurred to anybody that in the age of social media, representative politics is dead? And the two-party system is useless? And now, just think, the representative politics was invented in the railroad days. So you sent a rep across the country to present your ideas and your views and your preferences. In the age of the internet and social media, you don't need to do that. You pick up the phone and you're there.
Well, just to comment on that, comment, I agree, but, you know,
I just wanted to raise
yeah.
the perspective.
People have been talking for God knows how long about why can't we have direct democracy, everybody vote through their computers. And I've always, and other people have been concerned, and now with all this evidence of Russian hacking, basically, unless we want the Kremlin installing our leaders, that might not be the best idea. Okay, you had a question.
So
Next
you
one.
referred to all the predictions that came true. Which ones stand out the most in your mind from 67 or 65 that seemed strange then that have come to pass?
I mentioned, I mean, I think the global village was something, we all take it for granted, but it's almost hard to fathom unless you actually live through that age how far away we were from a global village in the 1960s. It was a great phrase, but there was really not much reality behind it.
I have a good one.
I
have an answer to that one.
Okay, go ahead.
In Understanding Media, Marshall says that someday a computer will be concerned with every facet of the destiny of a stick of gum. Sounds like Amazon Prime.
That's definitely something to chew on.
So in 1967, the environment would have been television, according to Marshall. So he's here in 67 and 68, and Tony Schwartz and others, it's television. So what is the environment today? Is it the same environment, or has it changed? And what is that environment?
Well, we're all carrying it, you know, in our pockets or somewhere. It's this. It's a screen. It has images on it. You can get sound from it. It has things that are printed. But it's no longer sitting around the living room or bedroom watching television. Listen, we have some books in the back, including the Lost Tetrads, Eric's new book, including the responsive chord, including a couple of other interesting books. I want to thank all of you. I also just want to take a quick moment to convey Terry McLuhan's greetings. She was listed on the program. She wished she could be here, but she couldn't. But we did get Eric. So listen, thank you very much.